Well, yeah, let's get going. Welcome everyone to our B Corp V2 recertification webinar. We are glad to kick this off. This is an exciting time for B Corps. The the changing requirements that are now in place are going to demand a lot of attention to the new standard and requirements and some preparation. And so we're here to unpack that and make it as simple as we can, understanding that it's a 1,000-page PDF that describes what's going on there. So maybe a few of these webinars will be important for folks to listen in on uh, at their, leisure on their time.
Oh, come on
So yeah.
now. It was 1,200 pages.
You're right. What was I doing?
Not
Rounding
saying,
down.
not saying from experience, but I had a really nice couch session over my Christmas break going through all of it. So, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to chat about it as, a company that helps other companies with this, but also someone who is in like the weeds and the ops of like actually running the B Corp certification process. So, hopefully, I can kind of talk with those two hats on.
Perfect. Well, with that, why don't we do some introductions? So, Aubrey, after you.
Yeah. So, hey everyone, I'm Aubrey. Among the many hats that I wear, I'm the ESG advisor for Culture Amp. Previously, I was there for 5.5 years, and I led people operations and ESG. And so I have been through um, we are coming up on our third B Corp recertification that I've been involved in, although Culture Amp's history of being a B Corp goes all the way back to 2017. So we've seen a lot of changes, and we've had actually a lot of change internally that was driven by the certification or initiated by that. So I'm really hoping that I can just give some kind of lessons learned operationally, and also talk about what the future looks like, knowing that we're kind of all stepping into a bit of a brave new world.
Absolutely. And I'm Director of Sustainability Reporting for Greenplaces. We're an all-in-one sustainability platform, helping companies with everything from carbon accounting to sustainability reporting to preparation for B Corp certification. And um, my background is in consulting and supply chain engineering before this, and I'm really happy to be working at Greenplaces now, um, and based in Denver, Colorado, although my background doesn't show Denver right now. Um, but I wanted to channel some tropical energy here today. And so, jumping into our agenda, today we're going to do an introduction to B Corp, the certification, the standard, key changes now as we move to version 2 of the standard. We'll talk through kind of the process compared to the old process. What's different? What do you need to know? We will dive deep into the specific impact areas under the new standard because they are different than previously. And we'll talk about third-party verification, which is a new aspect of the standard, something that's many B Corps may not be familiar with. So we'll unpack that a little bit. And then we want to talk about a case study, kind of a hypothetical example of a company that's going to recertify and notices that it has some gaps and how to address those, just illustratively to help people get prepared. And then we'll summarize it and talk about, how we're here to help.
I love that. So I thought there's maybe a mix of folks who are B Corps, but also folks who are maybe thinking about it or wondering what it is. So let's start kind of at the ground level. So when people say, what is a B Corp? A B Corp is a for-profit company that's been certified by B Lab, an independent organization for meeting high standards in terms of social, environmental, performance, transparency, and accountability. The way I think about this when I talk about folks is it's businesses actually taking a really principled stand about the way the business runs and making a statement that profit is not the only objective of the business. So that doesn't mean you can't make money, but B Corps are intentionally saying that they're investing resources and taking a broader kind of stakeholder-based approach to the objectives of the business. to situate this in historical context, I think we often talk about businesses being kind of profit maximizing, but that idea that that's something a business should do really only emerged in the 1980s. So, what B Corp is attempting to do by providing a really rigorous set of standards around what that responsibility looks like, in many ways, is actually really grounded in how businesses have historically been seen, but that's gotten kind of warped over the last 40 years. So I really want to ground this idea that this isn't a new idea. It's actually a quite old idea, and B Corp is a hugely important piece of infrastructure to help us move back towards a way of doing business that considers all of the trade-offs that are involved in running and operating one. So yeah, they talk about balancing profit and purpose. But for me, I just think about it as providing the infrastructure for businesses to be good citizens of the world. So, why would companies do this? I think there's quite a few different reasons. So, it's a way to actually do the work that you're trying to achieve by putting out all those PR statements about how you're committed to things like diversity and sustainability. It's really easy to update website copy, but it actually takes more effort to implement the kinds of operational initiatives or programs that actually achieve the B Corp standard. And this is increasingly important. So we know that millennials and Gen Z, for example, are a growing part of the consumer base and employee populations. They're much more motivated by things like values alignment. So even if you're kind of thinking in terms of traditional corporate metrics, demonstrating leadership in this area is actually viable from that perspective too. And it can help build brand trust. There's an incredibly low level of trust sociologically for institutions, including businesses right now. And so being able to say you're a B Corp is, in effect, a way to show your work for the things you say you're committed to. And I can also tell you from experience that investing in the things that are required to become a B Corp tend to lead to efficiencies and better decision making across the business, not just about things like social and environmental issues. So there's like operational value to doing this. And then again, there is a very large group of people who want to work with and for organizations that are aligned to their values and to sort of positive impact on society and the planet. And so this can become a competitive advantage in terms of talent acquisition, especially where you are dealing with tight talent markets or where you're looking for specialist skills where you may not be able to pay top dollar. Congratulations if you can. But what I found that is that it actually becomes something that can be even a differentiating factor against things like pay. So I can tell you, as someone who's been in HR for a long time, there's a huge number of people who will accept less money to do work that is meaningful and fulfilling. And this is a way that you can create those experiences for folks. And it's cool. Um, so I mean, a little bit of editorializing, but the reality is that tons and tons of companies have become Corp certified. And so, Riz, I'm really curious about like, tell me about the Greenplaces journey and like what kind of went into your thinking process and the work to get it done.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. For Greenplaces, obviously, we're a small, mighty, growing business, coming on our fifth year in business with just under 60 employees. And as a sustainability company, working on climate change and helping our customers address climate, we felt like there was really good alignment between the B Corp standard and kind of how we do business. Our CEO, Alex Lassiter, mentioned that our certification as a B Corp really reinforces what Green Places has stood for since day one, which is building a company that does well by doing good. And while we've got our CEO on board, I will say that it was really a grassroots effort that started within the employee base to go get this certification for the business. I think there was a realization that it would enable us from a credibility or perspective to go sell what we sell to our clients. And give them that reassurance that we are walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And then at the same time, you mentioned this before, employees want to work at B Corps, and we, have a number of employees who felt that way. And so that's kind of the driving motivator, and we achieved certification just last year in November.
That's so great. And Culture Amps journey is kind of similar. So I wasn't there at the time. I didn't join until 2020. But my understanding of the story is that an employee, shout out to Josh Sloan, basically got the idea that Culture Amp, which had always been dedicated to like building positive workplace culture, and the founders had often said that how Culture Amp builds the company is just as important as kind of the software it delivers. And so this employee kind of took it to the exec team and said, I think we should do this. And so I would encourage anyone on the call who's like, well, I'm not in the C-suite. What can I do? You can actually do a lot. I think most of the stories I hear actually start that way. Certainly, there are some CEOs who proactively seek this out, but I more often see it as a grassroots effort that then kind of gets the executive team on board. And so I would just encourage everyone who's excited about this, but maybe thinks they can't do much to reframe that to say that you could be the seed that sparks a total transformation in the business.
Absolutely. So let's dive into the V2 standard. We are going to talk through the specifics here for recertification, or could be your first time certifying. I mean, I think we're thinking about this in terms of recertification as B Corps have, that impending deadline coming up. But really, for any employee or CEO or aspirational company out there that's looking to get certified, um, this is the new process to do so. So the version 2 standard came into force this year, really this month. And this shift replaces kind of the former points-based B impact assessment model with what's considered as a standards-based approach, meaning that there are specific requirements in certain categories that must be met. There's no scoring per se, as there was previously, where, a minimum threshold of 80 out of 200 points needed to be achieved across multiple different topics. So given that initial change, and then also the longer term change, which is that there is a cycle now for continued audits and improvements and process verification, um, really see the B Corp standard as leading the way in terms of how companies are going to need to continue to demonstrate, good, sustainable operational practices. So let's first start by talking about the certification scope and track. So B Lab has instituted standards that apply to organizations based on their size so that it determines your certification track within the standards. So you can think of this as like certain topics are going to have requirements that are going to turn on at a certain threshold. And for many of those, it's right around the large category when you hit that 250 employee mark, or if you reach the 75 million revenue mark, that is when certain requirements are going to come into force. And so obviously, we know that many companies grow year over year. And so the certification track that you think you're in now or that you start in may not be the one that you end in. So it's important to look up and down the track here to make sure that you're, on target for handling those requirements.
Yeah, and one thing I would add that was a bit of a lesson learned for me in this is, and I think this happens kind of two ways in the new standards, is that moving up a level is certainly, great, the business is being successful, but often the level of detail and the number of requirements that you have to achieve go up. So, and I think that philosophically makes sense, right? That a bigger company with more resources is expected to do more. But if you are operating by looking backward to what you did 3 years ago and building your resourcing plan for recertification based on that, Don't do it without double checking, because I can tell you that I have had to rewrite a few project plans and pull in quite a few more folks than I originally anticipated, because that was something that, Culture Amp, which had grown quite significantly in 3 years between certifications, ran into. And so, again, forward planning, make friends with the folks in finance who can give you some
Mhm.
projections so that you have an eye on where you may end up when it comes time to file the paperwork.
Great call out. So as we think about the certification process here, we want to chunk it into three parts. The first part is the foundation requirements. These are the basics you need to meet as an organization to even really be eligible to complete the self-assessment. So these include things like legal accountability, making sure that you have consideration of all stakeholders, not just your shareholders in decision making, a declaration of interdependence, risk profile and assessment. So completing a risk assessment tool that generates your specific risk profile for your company. And then an eligibility check, which is going to include things like making sure the company's been operating for at least 12 months or equivalent and not operating in a prohibited industry. Once all of that is clear, you can initialize the self-assessment, which is really just completing the setup for that B impact assessment to confirm compliance with those fundamental criteria. And then we move into impact topic requirements. So there's specific sections across 7 different impact areas that must be addressed either prior to, during, or even after subsequently your completion of your self-assessment over that 3 and 5 year certification horizon. So we're going to get into those impact topics here in detail following this slide. But the final section here is your certification. And the V2 standards are certainly more rigorous and transparent and globally aligned than previously. So they now include independent third-party certification audits, which replaces the previous self-assessment model and assignment of a B Labs analyst to your case. There's also more regular monitoring of compliance during the 5 year cycle through surveillance audits, and then stricter eligibility criteria around those ineligible industries that I talked about in that foundation bucket. Finally, there's alignment now with internationally accepted sustainability frameworks like GRI and the EU's Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. So a lot has changed here, but we're going to go through the process here and um, make it as simple as we can. So starting with the impact areas overview, we're going to go through each of the 7. As I mentioned, um, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Joyce. So these are the 7 impact areas. We've got purpose and stakeholder governance, fair work, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, human rights, climate action, environmental stewardship and circularity, and government affairs and collective action. And so we're going to do a deep dive into each one of these, starting with the purpose and stakeholder governance impact area, or PSG for short. So the PSG impact area has 6 requirements for B Corp certification that mandate that companies embed purpose, accountability, and transparency directly into their core governance structures. This critical area ensures that a company defines and advances a meaningful public purpose, which is an explicit requirement for all companies. The standards then require the establishment of robust governance structures to monitor performance, which includes considering stakeholder impacts in decision making and having adequate procedures to address stakeholder grievances. Further, the company's social and environmental impact and stakeholder considerations must be monitored by the highest governing body and integrated throughout the organization. And the company must also be transparent about its social and environmental performance and engage in responsible marketing and public relations. So there's a lot here, but essentially it's defining specific governance requirements, things that many companies have, many companies don't, but that integrate those broader stakeholder concerns into how the company makes decisions.
All right.
Next, we'll
So
talk about fair work. Yeah, over to you.
yeah, so excited to talk about fair work. So, when we think about this impact area, the purpose is to try to create high quality jobs and cultivate the kind of workplace culture where everyone is treated with fairness and dignity. So, the impact areas focus on kind of four key requirements. So, setting clear expectations for employees, fair wage practices, listening to workers about their experience, and consistently measuring and improving the workplace culture. So the kind of culture, this is something that is really our bread and butter. So obviously, the company kind of started looking at employee surveys and things like that, but our tools have grown to enable fairness in performance review processes and things like that. But think of fair work as a little bit of kind of the floor of how you should be treating your people. And I think on a gut level, it makes sense, right? Pay people fairly, give them clear expectations about what their job is, and care about their experience. This to me is kind of step one of the human side of the impact areas. Next, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So basically, B Corp requires that, or B Lab requires that B Corps address potential and real inequities that show up within their organizational ecosystem. So the focus here is very much on equitable policies and measurement, transparency about the status quo, and improvement over time. So certainly Culture Amp, I was a customer and then an employee, and you used it to do all of my work, leading the DEI department there, among other things. But I just wanted to touch on something, which is that especially for companies that are looking to become B Corps, is there is kind of this headline narrative that like DEI or whatever you want to call it is dead, and that doesn't actually bear up with the empirics. So there's a lot of political hostility towards the idea that everyone should be treated fairly, which sounds very silly when you say it that way. But what I'm actually seeing behind the scenes is that companies are adjusting their language to be less triggering to racists. But they're not actually materially changing the underlying operations of what they're doing. And so I wanted to call that out because it can feel right now like if you're investing in JEDI work that you're doing it on a bit of an island, but that's not what's actually happening behind the scenes. So workers overwhelmingly think that people should be treated fairly at work. Things like pay equity audits and anti-discrimination work are actually still legally required in most jurisdictions. In some places like Australia, the requirements are actually getting more stringent, the UK as well. And so I just wanted to call that out that this might feel like a spicy thing, but operationally, it's actually kind of common sense. And so, a part of the challenge of navigating this for folks who are kind of stewarding these processes is actually grounding perceptions of backlash in empirical realities. So, I'd be happy to point folks to Pew Research about attitudes around equity and inclusion and things like that to kind of shape your stakeholders who may have concerns or see this as a risky place to invest in, that the actual risk is probably not doing it over investing here. So yeah, a bit of a socio-political soliloquy, but I think it's important to note that like a lot of companies still do this stuff really well. They just talk about it differently because someone's decided to polarize the language.
Hugely important. Couldn't agree more. I haven't seen any companies pulling back on their funding for employee resource groups or any kind of engagement there. But yeah, the phrasing is changing.
Right. It's like, I mean, I always ask that when people get, there's actually research that shows that when you use the term DEI, a bunch of people are anti it, but then when you just spell out diversity, equity, and inclusion, people flip their opinions.
Hmm. Wow.
Which sounds so silly, but I think if you're an advocate, it's really important to know that, like, personally, I'm not going to die on the hill of an acronym. Like, I'd rather make sure that people are paid fairly at work. But that's tactical advice, I guess, for like let go of language that no longer serves you. It constantly evolves and maybe will be useful again, but just focus on the concrete things. And when you get pushback, I think the most useful question is, what specifically are you objecting to? What
Hmm.
practice do you think is harmful? Because often people have like big feelings about this, but can't necessarily ground that concern or that pushback in a specific critique of something that they actually don't agree with. And so
Hmm.
that could be a useful way forward is to say, I want everyone to be treated fairly. Cool, here's how we do that. Here's the three things
Hmm.
we're thinking. What do you think about those ideas? And I have found overwhelmingly that you can get to a very good place of agreement that way.
Awesome.
Um, Next impact area is human rights. So, B Corp requires that companies respect human rights and take specific actions to prevent harm connected to their operations, their products, and their services. So, a lot of this looks like making sure that companies are engaging in appropriate due diligence, are trying to anticipate and remediate potential negative impacts, and are looking, especially in their supply chain to prevent or mitigate issues that could happen. So again, this is another example of where implementing this is going to require cross-functional collaboration. So legal, compliance, risk, procurement are all deeply involved in this. But I also want to note that there's a lot of regulatory complexity here. So, for example, I'm based in Australia. We have very extensive modern slavery legislation. And so, if you are complying with that law or it applies to you, you're actually probably already made some progress on impact areas like this. So, I wanted to call out that often it can be seen as B Lab or B Corp can be extra work, but the team has been really thoughtful about crafting the requirements here such that they're conformant with best practices in a lot of global legislation. So you can double dip in some ways that if you're following the law in some areas, you actually have already done a lot of the things that would count towards this. And so you get a bit of a double benefit.
Good call out.
Over to you for climate.
Yeah, let's talk climate. So, look, environmental impacts have been part of the B impact assessment, but now climate action is zone impact area, and B Corp V2 really significantly strengthens the climate requirements. Part of the push that we talked about earlier for international alignment and interoperability of the B Corp standard with other well-known sustainability frameworks. So this is really all about ensuring that B Corps take meaningful action to combat the global climate crisis. And the overall goal is to drive progress toward achieving net zero emissions by 2050. To do that, the requirements really focus on three major areas. So first, you have to have a process in place to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. That includes scopes 1, 2, and 3, your direct, indirect, and value chain emissions annually. Second, you need to show a clear commitment to contribute to keep global warming below the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So aligning with science-based targets there. And finally, it's not enough to just measure and commit. You have to actively implement and make measurable progress on a credible climate action plan. So essentially, you're measuring your emissions every year, you've set a target for reductions, and now you have to get there. So there's a lot of pieces here, especially for companies that may not be doing the foundational requirement. And we're going to unpack this in our case study. But certainly, there's a lot of effort that's going to go into this because measuring your emissions footprint as an organization means a lot of understanding of the complexities of how your business operates and where are you combusting fuels in your organization or where are your suppliers burning fuel and what goods and services are you procuring and the energy that you're buying. And so there's a lot of layers here to a greenhouse gas footprint. And well, suffice it to say that it takes more than just a few months to put one together. So we will definitely come back to this here during our case study, as I mentioned, but let's move on to the environmental stewardship and circularity impact area. So the sixth impact area that we're reviewing. And the goal of this standard is for B Corps to understand and reduce their environmental impacts while actively contributing to a more circular and sustainable economy. So these requirements are structured to ensure um, that you are taking comprehensive action. And to do that, first you have to clearly know the actual and potential negative impacts that your organization has on the environment. Once you've identified those, you've got to have a formal strategy in place to address those impacts and support staying within ecological thresholds. A really crucial component here is implementing circularity principles to reduce waste and lessen your impact on natural resources. And finally, you need to actively take action to prevent and mitigate any environmental harm. And so this is key. You're required to work with your suppliers to achieve these environmental objectives across your value chain. And so there's supplier engagement built in here as well. The final impact area we're going to cover is government affairs and collective action. And so this standard requires B Corps to look really beyond their own operations and actively contribute to broader social and environmental progress. So these requirements focus on ensuring companies take a responsible and transparent approach in a few key areas. First, you must have a responsible and transparent approach to lobbying. Second, you're required to work collaboratively, engaging in collective action to advance social or environmental impacts. And finally, particularly for the largest companies, this includes taking a responsible and transparent approach to tax practices. So remember, we talked about the certification tracks earlier. Certain of these topics, this one especially, is really looking at larger companies and how they do business and how they advocate for, change in government and through collective action. So now we're going to talk third-party verification. This may be new to a lot of folks here coming to learn about B Corp standards. So, Aubrey, why don't we kind of go through the new procedure here?
Yeah,
Over to
so
you.
um, So different than if you've been through a certification before, usually it's a self-assessment and you're assigned a B Lab analyst who helps you and kind of checks to make sure that the documentation and the evidence that you've selected is appropriate to meet the requirements of the standard. In this new version, B Lab is actually stepping out of the process to make sure that, everything you submit is valid. So this is actually really good in that it actually improves the integrity and quality of the B Corp certification by removing potential conflicts of interest. But on the other side, it is relatively new for parts of the business. So again, when I said go make friends with finance, not only because they're nice, but because most likely your finance folks are actually quite used to working with third-party auditors. And so there's likely some skill and experience in your organization already that you can lean on. But I'd say trade-offs or downsides, of this approach are that you need to build in more time for your certification. So assurance does take time because a third party, B Corp does have a couple of organizations that are sort of the dedicated ones doing this process, so they will be able to guide you to those partners. But it also means that there's greater documentation requirements and the rigor of the expectation of the documentation is much higher. And so this, I think, points to the criticality of not just keeping the idea of B Corp a grassroots effort, but that the reality is to do it successfully, it does need to be an organizationally blessed initiative with specific resources allocated to achieve certification. So that might be a mindset shift for some leaders who have seen it as like a great side project for employees to kind of gather and put together. I can tell you I've gone through processes that way, either with my consulting clients or with Culture Amp. But this new world is really going to force all of us to actually professionalize the operations of the certification process, which again, I ultimately think improves the quality of our operations, but it changes the way that we're planning. And then I think, as folks know, and I think for those of us that are with companies that work on the data side of this, noting that there's going to be increased scrutiny of the data that you're using, and part of that is due to, I think, a relatively common practice of ethics washing or greenwashing. And so, to me, all of this adds up to increased operational complexity, but also an increased value of the B Corp certification because these changes are a way to ensure that people who are seeing that logo understand that there's a high degree of integrity behind that, which again, I think is a differentiator in, a business climate where it is becoming normalized to be a bit sociopathically capitalistic. This is something that can actually drive commercial incentives for businesses by taking an intentional step not to go in that direction.
Yeah, it really does feel like I love your point about, the professionalization of this and especially considering sort of the origin stories we shared for Greenplaces and Culture Amp of, an employee-led initiative that, may or may not been fully funded or fleshed out, but got some momentum and, ultimately got approval. I do. I don't know if I worry, but I think that there will need to be more resourcing behind this effort in the future, given kind of the fact that this is going to be, yeah, reviewed by a third party. And there are going to be potential questions and, changes that need to be made to the organizational structure or to specific programs within the different impact topics. And so, that's probably going to require a little bit of budget.
Totally, it does. And I can speak quite literally, my kind of priority number one project for this week is actually writing up. So I've just been working on an audit, like a casual audit against the new standards compared to kind of the status quo. And the output of that is actually an analysis document trying to paint the picture, the 3-year roadmap of what's required operationally so that we can, confidently run a recertification when it happens. And
Mhm.
so that's something that I would encourage is those are really core business skills. So auditing, risk management and analysis and things like that. But I'm excited for the conversations, but I do think for a leader who is values aligned, but maybe not in the details of how to do this, may be an eye-opening experience to realize the delta in the resources that are required. And so, what I would note to folks is get in front of your champions really early so that you can get really aligned about what's required and then really enlisting those executive champions, whether it's a CEO or a founder or just a CXO who's excited to say, like, I really need you to fight for the resources for this if challenge or questions come up about why. What do you need from me? And so I'm doing a lot more work on equipping my stakeholders to kind of advocate and spread the message so that everybody's on the same page about why it's valuable and why it's valuable within the context of their function. And I would say that it's a necessary forcing function that ultimately I think benefits the companies. But if you're in charge, it's just something that I guess the bar has been raised for.
Mhm. The bar is definitely raised. So let's talk about a case study. This came up through some discussion, Aubrey, you and I had about kind of the requirements on companies that are changing and also the dependencies of certain requirements within certain impact areas. So we're going to walk through, um, an example here on the next slide of a recertification under the V2 standard with a focus on climate action as the impact area.
So I want to tell a little story before you dive
Yeah.
into case study. So something folks may not know. So Culture Amp has a sustainability program that I'm super proud of that we built during my time there. But the actual impetus for that entire department initiative, whatever you want to call it, existing was actually B Corp recertification. So there was a previous version of the world in which we scored a 0. In environment. And I say that not as judgment or shame, but it was actually looking at the fact that we had really great scores in some impact areas, and we really didn't have a lot to report in that environmental area. And B Lab gently told us that if that score continued, we wouldn't get recertified the next time. And that was actually like the initial spark that caused us to say, what would it look like to do this. And so I want to point out that like B Corp can be a really beautiful forcing function to do something that's values aligned, but maybe hadn't kind of gotten high enough up on the priority list yet. And so anyway, people can check out our 2025 ESG report if they want to know more about our particular climate work. But you can get an idea of what's possible in 3 years just by doing this assessment and realizing where your gaps still are.
3 years is actually the perfect time horizon for this.
That was a nice segue for you.
You nailed it. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. And we'll talk about recertifying, hypothetically, in let's say 2028. So your current B Corp, you're looking at the new standard, digesting 1,200 pages of insight and realizing, okay, we're going to have to do some work in climate action. As I mentioned before, climate action requires that companies, and in this case, let's take a large company, 250 employees, because all of these topics are then required. So climate action requires that companies measure their greenhouse gas emissions, they set targets aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C, and they implement a credible climate transition plan. So in that background context, let's say you don't have a greenhouse gas inventory. Well, it's important to start on that ASAP, and I'll tell you why. The requirement to set a target with science-based targets is that you have a base year greenhouse gas inventory. And so your first step is to measure so that you can manage your inventory and your footprint. And um, you're not going to be able to go through that target setting exercise without having a footprint, a greenhouse gas footprint. So, right off the bat, understanding that in order to execute SBTI target setting and in order to get third-party verification of your footprint, you're going to have to start a footprint. Well, to do a footprint, generally accepted best practices use the greenhouse gas protocol, identify scope 1, 2, and 3 categories of emissions within your organization that are relevant, and begin collecting data over a full fiscal year so that you can really define that base year that we talked about. Once you've done that, important to have a third-party review so that you don't have any material errors. And the reason I say that is if you go down the path of setting a target with SBTI and then you find out, oh shoot, we missed a category or we were off, we forgot a certain, some bills for air travel weren't included in business travel and we're going to have to restate. That is going to end up coming with an additional fee to recertify with SBTI. So you really want to be confident that your emissions profile is accurate before you go through with the certification or the verification under the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So let's take 2026 as kind of your assessment year. You're understanding what the requirements are, and you're really getting started with your greenhouse gas footprint and getting that solidified. You can do that internally. You're going to have to work with a number of stakeholders. You may bring on a partner or a software platform to help you do that, but at the end of the day, you're going to need a greenhouse gas footprint. Then in 2027, you need to take some action. So that includes submitting that greenhouse gas footprint to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, specifically their verification services arm, so that they can review your footprint and give you that stamp of approval for the reduction target. This is also when you may engage with a third-party auditor. You may also undertake a climate risk assessment here to understand where you've got risks in your value chain or on your business. That's also part of a good transition plan is that you identify opportunities to adapt to climate risks and to mitigate climate risks on your business. So understanding the ultimate goal here is to have a footprint, a target set, and a transition plan that tells you how you're going to get to from where you are today to where you're going. You're then in 2028 going to submit that self-assessment and attach the evidence of your verified target, your third-party emissions review, and your write-up on your transition plan. And so, the purpose here is to really articulate this is something that's going to be a multi-year effort to get to the outcome of B Corp certification with meeting the climate action requirements. But all of these things need to be funded. They need to be resourced. There needs to be internal collaboration across groups as varied as finance and IT and legal to execute these different elements of climate action. So, certainly a big lift, and this is just one of seven impact areas that we mentioned. Aubrey, do you have any kind of thoughts on the layout of this roadmap?
No, I think it points to the idea that if you're just looking at the requirements as a list and you're not analyzing them in terms of which are dependent on the others, it's really important. I also just want to put a little love out to the to Greenplaces because folks may not know we do partner with Greenplaces to do our carbon accounting and footprint mapping. So you can't say that, but I can say that. Um,
Very kind.
but that was something that for us, again, I want to emphasize, depending on where your business is, a lot of this says, oh, that's a lot of boxes to tick. But depending on where you are, a lot of it is conformant to regulatory requirements. So in Australia, in the EU, in California, requirements to document your emissions profile are increasing and coming into force in the next 12 months. And so, again, making sure that you're painting the picture that a lot of the things that are required for B Corp are required for other reasons as well. And so, either you will be ready when it regulatorily applies to you, or you're already legally subject to a requirement for it. And so, this is kind of a way to get extra credit for work that was already going to happen.
Hmm. Great. Well, with that, I think we can summarize. Um, and look, we understand there's going to be an ongoing learning curve here. So be prepared to attend more of these webinars and unpack more specific requirements within the standard. But really, we want to leave you just with some concrete actions that every current B Corp or aspirational B Corp is, can start with here today. And I think if I can boil it down, the key is to be proactive. Just consider what track your organization is going to be subject to and when, and understand the specific requirements on your organization under that track. But also, look up above as well in case you guys cross that threshold of either employees or revenues and move into the next tier so that you can be aware of those additional requirements. And look, if you need help, there's so many qualified partners that can support your journey. When it comes to building reliable data systems, governance structures, adopting policies, you can look for partners that can help you with templates, that can run engagement surveys, that can help you with those greenhouse gas inventories and footprints, stakeholder mapping, risk assessments, everything we mentioned here today. But just really be aware that, some of these requirements have dependencies. So start early. Um, Really, the earlier you start preparing, the more manageable certification process will be.
Absolutely. I would just emphasize, as kind of the business owner of some of this for a couple of businesses, is that the more rigorous you can get with your stakeholder management and your program management and kind of the what I would say are like the boring operational sides of this, I think the easier it's going to be. So I know that, those of us on the call really do this because we believe in the purpose and want to make the world better. But I just want to emphasize that it's actually really core business skills that get you from that intention to the outcome. And so yes, we love passion and things like that, but those kind of core organizational management skills are what actually get this done. So my point being, you have an incredible amount to bring to this work.
Well, that is our last slide. So, Aubrey, I think we can go ahead and thank everyone for joining us today. And obviously, we're available to help you navigate this complex change in standard, and you will see more of us on future webinars. But do not hesitate to reach out to either of us. You can find me on LinkedIn or reach out on our Greenplaces website. And Aubrey, I'm sure you're similarly reachable.
Yes, you are welcome to find me on my digital soapbox, which is usually LinkedIn, or jump on my website. But also, Culture Amp the business is available to help with these things if you have interest. You can reach out to me for a connection or jump on the website. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And to the Green Places team, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. Welcome back anytime. Thanks so much, Aubrey. Thanks, everyone.